Thank you all, and I'm grateful to have been privileged to listen to my colleagues on the panel and the various comments that they offered. I hope I have relevant supplementary comments to make, and I intend to begin with attending to the question not of religion, but of abuse of religion. I first visited South Africa on the occasion of the United Nations International Conference Against Racism and Xenophobia in Durban, 2001, if I'm not mistaken. And I had not had occasion to visit South Africa any time during the decades of apartheid, the sovereignty of apartheid over the territory of South Africa. But friends tell me that the heart, the educational, ideological heart of apartheid South Africa was the Dutch Reformed Church. The Dutch Reformed Church educated its constituents that in order to be a good Christian, one ought to be pro-apartheid, and anyone who was anti-apartheid was anti-Christ. Now that is not only sick, that is actually criminal. I want to point out that a similar pattern of abuse of Judaism takes place on a daily basis at the confessional level, at the media level, at the academic level, explicitly or implicitly, but it's hegemonic. In order to be a good Jew, so the equation goes, it's a criminal equation, one has to be pro-Zionist. If one is anti-Zionist, one is anti-Jewish racist, anti-Semitic. And the first task of people defending the values of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and approaching the subject of apartheid Israel from a humanitarian point of view is to break down that equation. And just as the anti-apartheid movement succeeded in breaking down the criminal equations first quoted, and actually replacing it with a humanitarian equation, in order to be a good Christian, one ought to be definitely anti-apartheid, and to be pro-apartheid is illegal and criminal. I would hope to see within my lifetime a similar equation progressively gaining hegemony, saying that in order to be a good Jew, one ought to be, it is necessary to be, it's imperative that one is anti-Zionist, and that affiliation to Zionist apartheid values is anti-humanitarian and criminal. So it is that abuse of religion that is a primary target, in my opinion, against any framework of Palestine solidarity. In that connection, I want to point to a religious situation. There is a religious community, a minority community in Palestine as well as overseas called Neturei Karta, the guardians of the city. When they pray, they use the same prayer book as criminal settler colonial invaders into Palestinian territories in the West Bank and elsewhere. The prayers are the same prayers. The hopes are, as printed black on white, are the same hope. Please, pleading with God to effect the ingathering of Jewish exiles in the Promised Land, pleading God that the temple, the Jewish temple on Mount Moriah would be resurrected as soon as possible. But when a Neturei Karta, an Orthodox Jew, reads these prayers, there is an underlying religious, profound religious assumption that that happens in God's time, at the will of God, and God's time and God's will and God's power is infinite, and it is criminal for a Jew to interfere with God's time or to assume the responsibility of assisting God in his or her endeavors or choices. Who is a human person? It's an entity that's has less than 100 years on the surface of planet Earth. Knowledge is limited, perception is limited. The duty of a properly religious Jew is to abide by the 613 commandments prescribed in a book called Shulchan Aruch, the set table, and await God's time. Abide by the law and await God's time. Zionism is an apostasy. Zionism is the worst crime that a properly religious Jew can perpetrate. And it will Carter walk on the Zionist Independence Day, burning Israeli flags and refusing to pay Israeli taxes. It's the abuse of religion in general, Christian with evangelist fundamentalists, Islam with people claiming to represent in Islam known as Daesh and Nusra. It's the abuse of religion that has to be challenged from a humanitarian point of view. The other point I thought worth making is the question of comparing Israeli apartheid with South African apartheid prior to the release of Nelson Mandela and the first democratic elections in South Africa. Mandela was released in 1990 and the first democratic elections in 1994. I have introduced the term apartheid into Palestine solidarity narrative and academic narrative about 3 decades ago. First book published under the title Israel and Apartheid State was published by Z Books in 1987, I believe. 1987, 97, 2007, yeah, 33 decades back. And the introduction of the term of apartheid met with considerable resistance, not only among pro-Zionist and pro-Israel apologists, but also within what is referred to normally as the Israeli peace camp, pointing to obvious differences in demographic constitution, differences in economic structures, pointing to the fact that both oppressor and oppressed in South Africa shared a communality, a confessional communality, the communality of Christianity, whereas the Israeli equation, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, has so-called Judaism on one part and Islam and Christianity on the second part, etc., etc., etc. And these are indeed differences. But to my reading, the primary difference is not there. And before going to point to what I regard to be the primary difference, I want to make sure that I'm clearly understood as to what I mean by the name of apartheid, and to distinguish the term apartheid from the term of popular xenophobia or popular racism. Because the Israeli embassy is quite right when they claim that popular xenophobia in Israel is not qualitatively different than popular xenophobia in other member states of the United Nations. That's quite true, and I attest to that in my experience. I was born in Jerusalem in 1943 and went through the Israeli educational system through kindergarten, elementary school, secondary, and university up to an MA degree. But apartheid is not just xenophobia and racism. Apartheid, to my understanding, is regulating racialist values through acts of parliament and applying the law enforcement instruments of the state in order to effect these values in practice. Applying law enforcement instruments, meaning the court system, the army, the police, the jail system, in order to enforce racialist values and racialist choices by acts of parliament. And in this respect, Israeli apartheid is identical to South African apartheid, and it's identical to South African apartheid at core. And the core is settler colonialism. 93% of the territory of the referred to commonly as Israel proper, not West Bank, not Gaza Strip, nor any territory beyond that, 93% of the territory of proper Israel is designated through acts of parliament, in law, for Jews only. I believe in South Africa, at the height of apartheid, only 87% of the territory of the Republic was designated in law for whites only. The apartheid divide in law is not between Jew and Arab, it's between Jew and non-Jew. the apartheid divide in law in apartheid South Africa, now happily in demise and no longer with us. It was between white and non-white. So that is apartheid. And the critical difference between Israeli apartheid and South African apartheid, to my reading, is that the South African sovereign was rather careless and did not really give particular attention to the necessity of veiling apartheid. So friends who visited South Africa in the decades of apartheid tell me that upon descent at Johannesburg airport, the apartheid hit the visitor straight in the face. Lines for whites and lines for non-whites, toilets for whites and toilets for non-whites, transport for whites and transport for non-whites. Those of you who have landed at Lida Airport would not see passport lines for Jews and passport lines for non-Jews, transport for Jews and transport for non-Jews, toilet for Jews and toilets for non-Jews. Israel is not only an apartheid state, Israel is guilty of crimes against humanity, not just war crimes. Israel is guilty for the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian Arab people, the indigenous people of Palestine, from the territories that came under its sovereignty. Over 500 localities, rural and urban, were ethnically cleansed and the remains leveled down to the ground. An organization called the Jewish National Fund has the apartheid task of veiling these atrocities, planting forests and developing recreational grounds on the ruins and on the lands of ethnically cleansed localities. The recreational grounds are not physically segregated, not tangibly segregated. On holidays and other occasions, one could see an Arab family barbecuing next to a Jewish family and children frolicking together on the swings. But I doubt that a JNF tour leader would take the group a few hundred meters further into the forest and point to the ruins of the Palestinian Arab village that has been ethnically cleansed and leveled down. One of the highlights of this atrocity is, of course, Lubia, where the Jewish National Fund planted the South Africa forest. And one of the purposes, or one of the items I have in my mind in the course of my visit, and I wish to thank the BDS South Africa and the Palestinian Embassy for allowing this visit and accommodating this visit and arranging and funding this visit. One of the objects I have in mind for this visit is adding a contribution to the progressive development that ultimately and hopefully will lead to the declaring of Zionist organizations of South Africa illegal under South African Constitution. Illegal, because the values of the Zionist bodies is wholly contrary and incompatible with the values of the Constitution of democratic South Africa. People were referring to the fact, when talking about South Africa and defeating a state with a massive, the largest military force in, not just in southern Africa, in the entire continent of Africa, defeating it by being armed by perseverance, commitment, and being led by humanitarian values. And I think one of my colleagues here on the panel said that this was thought to be not just not feasible, but impossible. And under a humanitarian leadership of the African National Congress, joined together with all other democratic bodies in apartheid South Africa, apartheid was defeated in South Africa without mobilizing an equivalent army. And indeed, this is a signpost for all freedom-loving individuals and movements and liberation movements that this is not just possible, but that is achievable. And in the case of Palestine and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the object of defeating apartheid Israel, there is an area where I believe emphasis ought to be ought to be focused, and that particular area will defeat the largest military power in the Middle East, illegally armed by nuclear power. And that is the area of so far established but fast fraying and weakening legitimacy of the State of Israel. The State of Israel, apartheid State of Israel, is not a legitimate state. A state that uses its sovereignty in order to perpetrate war crimes and crimes against humanity cannot be legitimate. A former president of apartheid Israel, going by the name of Shimon Peres, has identified the nullification of the legitimacy of the State of Israel as we know it, namely, he didn't say apartheid, but the State of Israel as established, the nullification of legitimacy of that state as a strategic danger to the state. And he's quite right. So additional to our tasks of step-by-step challenge the legitimacy of Israel at the civil society level, at the level of government institutions, municipalities and beyond, at the level of the United Nations organization, we need to go all the way up to the UN Security Council and demand that the State of Israel be subject to the binding, internationally legally binding covenant of the suppression and punishment of the crime of apartheid, and its legitimacy in this capacity being nullified under international law. It's doable, it was done here, and it will be achieved in Palestine, and thank you very much.